single bottle of white vinegar, costing less than £2 at any corner shop, will clear a kitchen of roaches faster than anything sold by a pest control firm. There are 35 separate ways to use that same bottle against ants, spiders, mice, bedbugs, moths, fleas, and silverfish, and none of them require a single call to an exterminator or a single monthly payment to keep working. I grew up in a stone farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales, where my grandfather kept a jug of vinegar on the pantry shelf the same way other households kept salt. He did not read about pest control in a magazine. He learned it from his own father, who learned it from the lean years after the war, when nothing was thrown away and nothing was wasted, and a shilling spent on a chemist-bought spray was a shilling that could not be spent on food. I watched him wipe down skirting boards with a vinegar rag every Sunday evening, and I watched the ants that used to march across our kitchen floor simply stop coming. He kept a second bottle by the back door for the mice that came in from the fields each autumn, and a third smaller bottle in the linen cupboard for reasons I did not understand until I was much older. The farmhouse itself was built from Yorkshire stone in the 1800s, with walls thick enough to hold the cold in winter and gaps enough in a building that old for almost anything small enough to find its way through. These were not experiments to him. They were Tuesday. He did them because they worked, and because in a farmhouse with 3 children and very little spare money, there was no other option. My grandmother used to say that a house run on vinegar never smelled of anything false, and I did not understand what she meant until I lived in a city flat as a young man, surrounded by the sharp chemical scent of shop-bought sprays that never quite disappeared. I am sharing what they taught me now because fewer and fewer people still remember it, and that is a shame worth putting right. Somewhere along the way, a jug of vinegar on the shelf was replaced by aisles of sprays, traps, and contracts with monthly pest control companies. Whole industries grew up around convincing people that insects and rodents required chemicals with long names and warning labels, sold at a steady price every single month rather than a single small bottle bought once and used for a year. It is worth remembering that a great many of these problems were being solved in English farmhouses and terraced houses for generations, using nothing but vinegar, a cloth, and a bit of patience. Long before any pest control van ever pulled up outside a house, there was very little profit to be made from a bottle that costs less than £2 and lasts for months. So it is not surprising that the knowledge of how to use it quietly fell out of everyday conversation. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up for a video. These were methods tested across hundreds of winters in cottages with no central heating and no spare income, by people who simply could not afford for them to fail. They worked then, and they still work now, because a cockroach or a mouse has not changed its habits in 200 years. No matter how the shops around it have, there are 35 separate ways to use vinegar against the pests I am about to describe, and I will go through each one in turn. So I would ask you to stay with me, even through the ones that do not concern your home just at the moment, because the pest that troubles you next winter may not be the one troubling you. Today, the first method concerns roaches, and it begins with a plain spray. Mix equal parts white vinegar and water in a bottle and spray it directly along skirting boards. Under the sink and around the cooker where grease tends to gather, roaches breathe through small openings along the sides of their bodies, and the acetic acid in vinegar disrupts that process on contact, which is why a direct spray works faster than most shop-bought sprays that only repel rather than kill. This was a method well known in Victorian scullery kitchens, where coal ranges kept the room warm all year and roaches were a constant companion of anyone who cooked over an open fire. The second method is a soaked rag left overnight along the base of kitchen cabinets. Since roaches travel along the edges of rooms rather than through open floor space, and a vinegar-soaked cloth in their path does more good than one sprayed in the middle of a room. The third method uses vinegar poured directly down kitchen and bathroom drains. Since roaches often travel up through plumbing from communal pipework, and a cup of neat vinegar left standing in the drain overnight removes both the scent trail they follow and any egg cases stuck to the pipe walls. The fourth method is for cupboards themselves, wiping every shelf with a vinegar and water solution before restocking. Since roaches are drawn to the faint residue of spilled sugar and flour, that ordinary washing up liquid does not fully lift. My grandfather always did this on a Friday, before the weekend shopping was put away, so that nothing new went into a cupboard that had not already been cleared of scent. There was another habit he kept as well, treating the hinges and undersides of cupboard doors, since roaches will shelter in a warm, dark hinge gap during the day and only venture out once the kitchen light has gone off for the night. He also kept a particular eye on the gap behind the cooker itself, a place most people never think to clean, where heat, grease, and darkness combined to make almost perfect shelter for a roach, and a monthly vinegar treatment there did more good than any amount of surface cleaning elsewhere in the kitchen. Keep watching, because the methods for ants work on a different principle entirely, and it is the one most people get wrong. Ants navigate almost entirely by scent, following a chemical trail left by the ants ahead of them, and this is the key to the fifth method, which is wiping down the exact path they are, using with neat vinegar. Once that trail is gone, the ants behind lose their way completely, and the column simply stops within the hour, often before the first ants have even reached the kitchen counter. The sixth method is treating the entry point itself, usually a gap under a window frame or a crack beside a pipe, with a thick line of vinegar reapplied daily for a week, since ants will attempt the same entry point repeatedly until the scent discourages them for good. The seventh method is for outdoor anthills near the house, where a strong solution of vinegar poured directly into the mound, ideally in the cooler part of the morning when the ants are closest to the surface, will disrupt the colony without the need for the granular poisons sold for the same purpose. This was a method used well before the war on farms across the Dales, where an anthill too close to a grain store was treated as a serious concern rather than a minor nuisance. The eighth method addresses sugar bait stations that ants sometimes create around bins or compost, and a vinegar wipe of the bin lid, handle, and surrounding ground removes the sweetness they are drawn to in the first place. Patio slabs and garden paths near a back door are worth the same treatment in warmer months, since ants often build their main colony just beneath a slab where the stone holds the day's heat well into the evening. One small habit worth mentioning here is wiping the rim of jam jars and honey pots with a vinegar cloth before they go back in the cupboard, since a single sticky ring left behind is often all it takes to start a new trail from scratch. My grandfather used to say, the ants were never really after our food, they were after the smell we left behind, and cleaning that smell away was always more useful than chasing the ants themselves around the skirting board with a rolled-up newspaper. That is only 2 of the pests dealt with, and the remainder of this video covers the pests people struggle with most, which are the ones that hide rather than march openly across a kitchen floor. Spiders respond to vinegar differently than insects do, since it is the smell itself they avoid rather than any effect on their bodies. And spiders taste the world through their feet far more than through any sense we would recognize. The ninth method is a vinegar and water spray applied to window frames, door frames, and any corner where cobwebs tend to reappear, reapplied roughly once a fortnight through the autumn months when spiders are most active indoors. The 10th method is treating the outside of the house at ground level, along the base of exterior walls, since most spiders enter a home by walking rather than flying, and a treated perimeter reduces how many make it inside at all. The 11th method is for existing webs, wiping them away with a vinegar-dampened cloth rather than a dry duster, since the residue left behind discourages a new web being built in exactly the same spot, whereas a dry duster simply clears the way for a fresh one within a day or two. The 12th method is treating woodpiles and coal stores near the house, which were common in Yorkshire cottages and remain common today. Since these areas draw spiders in cold weather looking for shelter close to a warm wall, a related habit is checking behind picture frames and curtain rails once a season, wiping the wall behind each with a vinegar cloth, since spiders favor the still undisturbed air behind hanging objects more than almost anywhere else in a room. Old stone cottages tend to have more spiders than newer houses simply because the walls are thicker and hold more small gaps, and this is why the outdoor perimeter treatment matters as much as anything done indoors. Since it stops the problem before it ever reaches the front door, mice require a more careful approach, since vinegar does not harm them, it simply repels through scent, and this changes how the method is used. The 13th method is cotton wool balls soaked in neat vinegar, placed along skirting boards and inside cupboards where droppings have been noticed, replaced every 3 or 4 days as the smell fades. The 14th method is treating likely entry points directly, and mice can pass through a gap the width of a pencil, so any hole near pipework, floorboards, or the base of doors should be wiped with vinegar before being sealed properly with wire, wool, or filler. Since wire wool alone does not remove the scent trail that first drew the mouse there, farmhouses in the Dales dealt with this constantly, since a stone building always settles slightly with the seasons. Opening small gaps each winter that had not been there the summer before, and a yearly inspection with a vinegar cloth in hand was simply part of preparing the house for the cold months. The 15th method is for pantry protection, storing flour, oats, and other dry goods in containers, with vinegar-soaked cotton tucked nearby. Since mice are drawn to these stores above almost anything else in the house, the 16th method is a floor wash for kitchens and utility rooms, using a strong vinegar solution weekly, which removes the crumb and grease trails that draw mice toward a kitchen in the first place. The 17th method is treating the underside of appliances, such as the cooker and the fridge, pulled out once a season and wiped along the wall and floor behind them. Since this narrow gap is one of the warmest, quietest places in a house, and mice will nest there readily if it is never disturbed, my grandfather kept a particular respect for mice more than for any insect, because a mouse that gets comfortable in 56 days will have grandchildren of its own, and he always said the first sighting was the only warning a household would get. He would check the flour bin before he checked almost anything else in the house. Since a fine dusting of flour on a shelf shows a mouse's tracks more clearly than any other surface in a kitchen, a trick he learned from his own mother during rationing, when a single spoiled sack of flour was a genuine hardship. This next part is where most people are surprised, because bedbugs are usually treated as the hardest pest of all, and yet vinegar handles more of the problem than most people expect. Bedbugs hide in seams, joints, and folds rather than open surfaces, which is why the 18th method focuses on mattress seams specifically, sprayed with a strong vinegar solution and left to dry fully before bedding is replaced. The 19th method treats the bed frame itself, particularly wooden joints and the underside of slats. Since bedbugs shelter in these gaps during daylight, and a vinegar spray disrupts both the insects present and the eggs laid in the grain of the wood. The 20th method is for luggage after traveling, wiping the interior lining and seams of a suitcase with vinegar before it goes back into storage, which was common practice in guest houses across the north of England long before modern pest control existed. The 21st method is washing affected bedding in the hottest wash the fabric allows, with a cup of vinegar added to the load, since the combination of heat and acidity is more effective than either used alone. The 22nd method treats skirting boards and carpet edges near the bed, the same border areas. Roaches favor, since bedbugs use these same roots to move between rooms in a house. A further precaution worth taking is vacuuming the mattress and headboard thoroughly before any vinegar treatment, since a vinegar spray works on contact and cannot reach what is buried beneath dust and loose fibers. Bedbugs were a genuine hardship during wartime billeting, when families across England took in strangers for weeks or months at a time with almost no notice, and a jug of vinegar kept by the back door for guests' luggage was as ordinary then as a spare set of keys would be today. None of these steps on their own will finish the job in a single evening, but together, repeated over a week or two, they remove both the insects present and the conditions that allowed them to settle in the first place, which is worth remembering before reaching for anything stronger. Fleas respond well to a similar approach. And the 23rd method is a vinegar rinse for carpets, applied lightly with a spray bottle and worked in with a stiff brush before vacuuming once dry, since fleas lay their eggs deep in the pile where a surface treatment alone cannot reach. The 24th method is for pet bedding, washed weekly with vinegar added to the rinse cycle, since fleas lay eggs in fabric fibers far more than on the animal itself. The 25th method is treating skirting boards in rooms where pets sleep, using the same vinegar and water spray already described for ants and roaches, since fleas favor the same low, undisturbed edges of a room. A dog or cat can be wiped down with a very weak vinegar and water solution as well, kept well away from the eyes, which was a common farmhouse habit long before flea collars were sold in any shop. Flies and moths are drawn to vinegar in a different way, since certain preparations attract rather than repel, and this is where the 26th method comes in. A shallow dish of apple cider vinegar with a drop of washing up liquid, left uncovered near a fruit bowl, draws fruit flies in and traps them at the surface. a trick used in English larders since before refrigeration was common, when overripe fruit could not simply be thrown away without a second thought. The 27th method is for clothes, moths, storing woolens with small vinegar-soaked cloths sealed inside a drawer or trunk, since the scent discourages moths from laying eggs in stored fabric. The 28th method treats wardrobe corners and drawer joints directly with a light vinegar wipe each season, particularly before winter woolens are packed away for the summer months, since it is in that long storage period that most moth damage actually occurs. A windowsill treatment is also worth mentioning. A light vinegar spray applied where houseflies tend to settle in warm weather since flies. Avoid landing on a surface that carries the scent even faintly. Wool was precious enough in the Dales that a single moth hole in a good jumper was treated as a real loss. And this is why the vinegar cloth in the wardrobe was never treated as optional in my grandmother's house, no matter how mild the winter had been. A hanging cloth soaked in vinegar and left near a kitchen window during the warmer months also does a fair job of keeping flies from settling on the glass in the first place. Long before they ever make their way toward the food on the counter, silverfish and pantry beetles are less discussed but were a genuine problem in older English homes with damp cellars and stone floors, and the 29th method is a vinegar wipe of bookshelves and skirting in damp rooms, since silverfish are drawn to both moisture and the starch in paper and glue. The 30th method treats flour bins and cereal containers directly, wiping the inside rim with vinegar before refilling. Since pantry beetles most often arrive already inside a packet from the shop rather than from the house itself, the 31st method is for bathroom tiles and grout lines, sprayed with neat vinegar and left for several minutes before wiping. Since silverfish are drawn to the same damp grout lines that draw mold in a poorly ventilated bathroom, a cellar or understairs cupboard, if the house has one, benefits from the same treatment twice a year, since these were the rooms my grandfather always checked first, long before any sign of trouble appeared in the rest of the house. Old stone farmhouses in the north of England were particularly prone to damp in the colder months, and it was common practice to leave a shallow dish of vinegar in a cellar corner overnight, drawing moisture and silverfish alike away from stored linens and papers. The remaining methods are less about a single pest and more about the house as a whole, which my grandfather always said mattered more than any single spray. The 32nd method is a seasonal deep wipe of every doorway threshold with vinegar. Since this is the boundary every crawling pest must cross to get inside at all. The 33rd method is treating bin areas both indoor and outdoor with a weekly vinegar wash, since bins are the single greatest draw for roaches, ants, and flies in most homes. The 34th method is for compost heaps kept close to a house, where a vinegar barrier along the nearest wall reduces how many insects move from the compost into the building itself. This was a lesson learned the hard way on farms where the compost heap sat too close to the kitchen door, and generations of practical experience eventually pushed most households to keep both the heap and the vinegar barrier a good distance further out. The 35th and final method is a vinegar rinse for outdoor drains and gutters near ground level, applied once a season, since standing water in these areas breeds the very insects that later find their way indoors long before any of them are ever seen inside the house. Beyond the 35 methods themselves, there is one habit that ties them all together, which is simply consistency, keeping a jug of diluted vinegar made up and ready in the kitchen at all times, the way my grandfather did, so that any small trail or sighting can be treated within the hour rather than left to grow into a proper infestation over a week or two of being ignored. I think about my grandfather's pantry shelf often, and how a single unglamorous bottle did the work that today gets split across a dozen branded products, each with its own cost and its own contract. None of what I have described here is clever in the way a new invention is clever. It is simply old, tested, and kept alive by people who had no choice but to make it work. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing you do not need to wait for a van to arrive or a delivery to turn up before a problem in your own home can be dealt with, and that confidence was ordinary once in nearly every household in this country. My grandfather was not a wealthy man, and he was not a formally educated one either, but he never once seemed worried about a pest problem in his own house, because he had 35 ways of dealing with it before it ever became a proper problem at all. That Kind of steadiness is worth more than people tend to credit it for, and it does not require a farmhouse in the Dales to hold on to, only a bottle on a shelf and a willingness to use it. What was lost was not the knowledge itself, only the habit of reaching for it. And that habit is a very easy thing to build back, one small bottle at a time. If this has been useful to you, there are a great many more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same old ways my grandfather taught me at that kitchen table in the Dales, and from the neighbors and farmhands who sat at it alongside him over the years. None of it is complicated, and none of it costs very much at all. They are still here, waiting. You simply have to know where to look.